teaching ministry of Starlight Church, coming to you from Tustin, California. Great weather we're having today. I'm not sure where it is in your neck of the woods, but today is great here. We've been in the book of Daniel. And the purpose of the book of Daniel as such in these last few weeks has simply been to get to a point where Nebuchadnezzar has his dream. And you might say, well, good grief, I thought this was a church service. What's the purpose of a dream sequence by some guy in 560 BC? What possible relevance or what bearing does that have on us today? How does that get me through the week as such? And the whole purpose of this is simply to get you to have confidence in this book. That when this book says X, Y, or Z, that you have confidence that the X, Y, and Z is correct. That's the whole purpose of something like this. And I won't give a whole big background as to the origins of this or how we got here. Just encapsulated form. Daniel is captured when Nebuchadnezzar comes down in 560 BC, and he takes Israel, takes Jerusalem. Daniel is taken captive back to Babylon. He and a bunch of his friends are designated to work ultimately in the government, in the palace. So they have a 3-year training regimen. They have to learn the language, they have to learn the customs, they have to learn everything Babylonian as such, so that they can function and work around and with the king. At the end of this period of time now, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. None of his soothsayers, magicians, the Chaldeans, prognosticators, fortune tellers, tarot readers, nobody can interpret this dream for him. And so he says, "Away with you. You're worthless. I'm going to kill the whole lot of you." So they're all slated for the death penalty. Daniel hears about this and he says, well, I don't want to get axed like this. I don't want to have to go out at this stage of my life. And so he asked the Lord if the Lord would grant him the privilege of being able to decipher this dream for Nebuchadnezzar. And that way he and all of his buddies get off the hook, as it were. And God does. And basically the dream is going to center around a giant image. Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and on the plains of Shinar, outside of Babylon, he sees this huge monster image, a statue, if you please. And the statue has several components. Obviously, it's the shape of a person. It's got the head, the chest, the belly, the legs, the feet, and toes, and so forth. But what's interesting to Nebuchadnezzar is the makeup of these various elements. Let's start in Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2. This is the purpose of the book here. Verse 29. Daniel is speaking. He's getting ready to tell the king what the king wants to hear, the interpretation of the dream. And in verse 29, Daniel says, "As for thee, O king, the thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed, what should come to pass hereafter." It's a prophetic dream. In other words, it's history in advance. What should come to pass hereafter? And he that revealeth secrets maketh known to thee what shall come to pass. That's the essence of it. He says, I'm going to tell you history in advance. And Nebuchadnezzar's ears perk up. And Daniel continues down in verse 31. Daniel's going to explain the dream. Thou, O king, this is Nebuchadnezzar. Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. This image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon the feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and wind carried them away, and there was found for them, and the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. So Daniel recounts the dream. You saw an image. The image had a head of gold, chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of brass, legs of iron, and feet and toes, a mixture of clay and iron. Now he's really got Nebuchadnezzar's attention, because up to this point, none of his guys even had a clue as to what this was. Daniel nailed it, and he knew it. What this image and the elements and the way it's broke down, what it represents is Gentile history. There's a term that Jesus uses in Luke chapter 24, and he refers to a phrase referred to, or he calls the times of the Gentiles. And what that simply means is that up till now, up to when Zedekiah was conquered, Jerusalem and Israel and so forth was taken by Nebuchadnezzar and carried off into Babylon. The last Jewish king, Zedekiah, was the last Jewish king until the King of Kings in Revelation chapter 19 comes back. That's Jesus Christ himself. So between Zedekiah and Jesus Christ, there will not, or there has not been, a Jewish king sitting on a Jewish throne in the city of Jerusalem. When Nebuchadnezzar came in, that ended, as far as Israel is concerned, the Jewish rule as such. And it now became the Gentile time. You remember, even when Jesus was alive, Israel wasn't in charge. It was Rome that was in charge at that point. Pilate was the Roman governor who presided over the crucifixion of Jesus. The Jews had no power to orchestrate corporal punishment. They had to go through Rome if they wanted to have somebody executed. So the times of the Gentiles simply is a term referring to the fact that Israel has no king, Israel has no throne as such. The Gentiles have taken over the country and the area. So what Daniel has prophesied here in advance, that's the nature of prophecy. You tell something in advance. There's going to be 4 successive world kingdoms, followed by a 5th, which is an amalgamation or an extension of the 4th. And it's kind of an oddball one compared to the first 4 here. And the 4 are this: Babylon, which is symbolized by the head of gold. Babylon was followed by the Medo-Persians, which is represented by the chest and the arms, and that color was silver. The Medo-Persians were followed by Greece, which is represented in the belly and the thighs, and that designation was brass. And the Greeks were followed by the Romans, and the Romans were depicted by the two legs. And that element was the element of iron. And then at the tail end, the extension of the two legs, we have the feet and the toes, which were designated as clay mixed with iron. These are the 5 world empires that are going to come after Nebuchadnezzar has taken over. So what do we learn? Now we've got hindsight, 2020 vision. We're sitting here in 2021. We can look back in history. We know when Nebuchadnezzar ruled. We know the sequence of events that take place in history because they're written down. We have records. Who conquered what, who conquered when, how long they lasted, and so on and so forth. It's no big secret for us. We just look back in history with 2020 hindsight and say, yeah, that's the way it unfolded. But keep in mind, from Daniel's perspective, none of this had unfolded yet. Nebuchadnezzar was in his 2nd year of reign when this vision came and this dream came. So as far as Daniel is concerned, there is no history here as such. He's in the very, very beginning of the very first of these empires. He had no clue what the Medo-Persians were going to do or what the Greeks were going to do. He probably never even heard of Rome, let alone the extension of the feet and the toes, which are represented now as what we still refer to as the European common market. Daniel had no inkling of any of this stuff when he wrote this. So we begin 560 BC. Nebuchadnezzar comes down. Israel is taken. That empire lasted for approximately 21 years. When the Medo-Persians came and they conquered Babylon. Babylon was the head of gold. The Medo-Persians, a dual monarchy, if you please. You got the Medes, you've got the Persians. The Persians are modern day Iran. If you want to get a historical context as to what nations we're talking about here. So when they talk about the Medo-Persian Empire, we're talking about Iran and the Medes, which were northern Turkey, as such, in today's vernacular. So in 539 BC, approximately 21 years after Nebuchadnezzar takes over, the Medes and the Persians take over. Approximately 189 years later, Alexander the Great conquers Egypt. Now keep in mind, the focal point of all what the Bible refers to as world history is always Israel. Africa is not, well, northern Africa is, but southern sub-Saharan Africa is not factored in. The South Sea Islands, Polynesia, the Philippines, Southeast Asia, and so forth, that's not factored in. North and South America are not factored in. One of the big reasons why America, as such, is not listed or mentioned in the end times directly is because geographically and spiritually, it's just not factored in. Everything is centered around Israel and those immediate countries that have direct influence on Israel. So 560 BC, Nebuchadnezzar takes over. 539 BC, the Medes and Persians take over. 350 BC, Alexander the Great comes in. He takes over Egypt, which now gives him control over the Holy Land and over Israel and so forth. Approximately 394 years after Alexander takes over, the Romans take over. They're in charge when Jesus is born. They're in charge when the Gospels are written. The book of Acts is taking place. They're in charge for this whole scenario. Approximately 1,594 years later, the European Common Market comes into view. 1958. We've got a total, roughly, of 2,184 years, give or take a few years here. Over 2,000 years of history in advance that Daniel saw, and he had the guts to put in writing. He staked his name on it. And it wasn't any big deal for him because God had given him the revelation. God had given him this information. And so he felt, all the confidence in the world to be able to go ahead and put this stuff down. You'll notice several things about this image. Now, keep in mind, we've got this image, the head of gold, the arms and the chest of silver, the belly of brass, the legs of iron, and the feet and the toes, iron mixed with clay. The first thing you notice about this, there is a degeneration as far as the value of these materials. Gold is much more valuable than silver. Silver is more valuable than brass. Brass is more valuable than iron, and iron is more valuable than clay and iron mixed together. There's a degenerative value here from the head to the toes. Give you a hint. We in 2021, we are not living in the head portion of this image. We're not in the silver portion of this image. We're not in the belly, the brass or the iron. We are way down at the toes, the toenails, if you please. That's how far we are into this image. Things are not getting better and better. Newton's second law of thermodynamics, anything left to itself, by nature, deteriorates. It falls apart. Everybody who's lived more than 5 years old and up knows this theory. Little kid gets a new toy in Christmas time or his birthday. 2 days later, maybe the toy's trashed. You buy a new car. A year or two later, it begins to fall apart. Go right down the line. Every single thing in nature falls apart. It is a law. Babylon, under Nebuchadnezzar, was an absolute monarchy. He had the power of life and death. He had the power to do anything and everything he wanted. There was no restraints on this guy. Nebuchadnezzar was a king like very few other kings. We're talking worldwide here now, not just some local tribal guy who has the power of this or the power of that. This was a biggie. And Nebuchadnezzar was a king like no other in that respect. When the Medo-Persian Empire came along, keep in mind, they're represented by the chest and the arms, the two arms, the Medes and the Persians, two of them together acting as one. They had a system of government whereby they had a king or an emperor, but there were certain built-in restraints with this guy. In other words, once a law had been enacted and a law had been formulated and put in writing, that law could not be changed. Case in point, when Daniel was to be thrown into the den of lions, they had tricked Darius, the current king at that point. They had tricked him into signing an edict whereby Daniel was going to get caught up by his, enemies, the people who didn't like him. They formulated a plan whereby he was going to get tripped up, and the king was going to get mad, and the king was going to author a decree whereby he was going to be executed, and the form of that execution was going to be thrown into a pit of lions. And the lions were going to eat him up, type thing. After Daniel had been framed, as it were, after the law had been written that, yeah, Daniel is going to be executed by getting thrown into the pit of lions, it came to Darius's mind, and it was revealed to him that they had set Daniel up. He wasn't a bad guy. They had set him up. And at that point, he freaked out because he wanted to reverse or to nullify the law that he had written into effect about Daniel's execution, but he couldn't do it. He didn't have that power. Once that law was in writing, the guy who wrote it even didn't have the power to change it. This was referred to as the law of the Medes and Persians, that once that law had been formalized in writing, that was it. So there were certain restrictions on the Medo-Persian emperors and kings that Nebuchadnezzar didn't have. We get down to Greece. Greece had a loosely fit monarchy backed by military. So it was even a lesser form of autocracy and complete control than the Medo-Persians, and the Medo-Persians were less than Nebuchadnezzar. By the time we get to Rome, we do have Roman emperors that are pretty bad guys, obviously. But there was the Senate of Rome. And theoretically, the Senate of Rome still had, even in its weakest moments, it still had elements of power within it that the emperor had to dance around, and the emperor had to, or the Caesar, I guess technically at this stage, Caesar had to keep in mind he couldn't just arbitrarily do whatever he wanted to do. Case in point, ask Julius Caesar how that worked out for him. He's killed in the Senate because he wanted to make himself a dictator for life, and they said, no way. So the power of these emperors, just like the elements themselves are degenerating in value, so is the power degenerating in value as to what they can and cannot do. Another interesting point is that when Daniel made this prediction and wrote this history in advance, if you please, at that point, Babylon obviously ruled the world. 2 years into Nebuchadnezzar's reign, when he had this vision. But the Medes and Persians at that time, who were 21 years later going to take over Babylon, at that point, they were still just a vassal state. They were a subsidiary. They were just a conquered people of Babylon. They weren't big guys on the block at all. When you get and look at Greece, at the time that Daniel made his prediction, Greece was nothing more than a bunch of warrior states, city-states, like Athens was a big guy in their block. Sparta was a big guy in their block. You had Thrace, you had Macedon, you had all these divergent parts that eventually, under Alexander the Great, would become one. But up until then, up until Alexander, Greece was just a bunch of warring city-states. Sparta against Athens, Athens against Thrace, Thrace against Macedonia, and so on and so forth. At that time that Daniel wrote his prediction, Rome was still literally just a village on the Tiber River in Italy. In 560 BC, they hadn't done anything great. By the 2nd century or so, they would win the Punic Wars with Carthage, and they would basically control most of the Mediterranean sea coasts. But it wasn't until they conquered Egypt that they became rulers of the world as such. So keep in mind that when Daniel wrote this thing, all these subsequent kingdoms and all these empires were just little, they weren't even fragments of imagination in anybody's brain. So we notice that the elements are degenerating, from gold to silver to brass to iron, and to iron mixed with clay. We notice the value of these things is degenerating. We also notice, and I'll reiterate again, because there's a lot of Christians who still adhere to the theory of relativity. Things are getting better and better. And the biggest thing today is because our technology is getting better and better as such, it's getting faster and faster and smaller and smaller. And we can do things today that we couldn't have even thought of 20, 30, 50, 100 years ago, that somehow in our mind, we're getting better and better. We're not. From a moral standpoint, from an ethical standpoint, from a political standpoint, just whatever criteria you want, except that one little element, technology, we're worse than we've ever been in our history. It's just, listen to the news. Look at what's going around outside. So the elements are getting baser and baser and baser. The value is getting baser and baser and baser. The authority of these guys gets watered down and watered down and watered down. It's getting worse and worse. When we get to the feet and toes, that's where the bottom really falls out. You notice that the elements that make up the feet and toes, it's iron mixed with clay. They are co-mingled, but they're not really mingled. It's still iron and it's still clay. It's put together. And within this element, it's still iron mixed with clay. It's not like if you take flour and you add water, you get dough. And within that dough, you can't really separate now the flour from the water. It's been amalgamized, it's been mixed, it's been co-mingled to a point where you can't really distinguish the flour part from the water part. It's different with these 10 toes. They are still iron, it's still clay, and they're mixed together in some hybrid fashion. This is the worst of all the elements that we've had so far. It's worse than the iron, it's worse than the brass, it's worse than the silver, it's worse than the gold. It's just getting worse and worse and worse. And we'll get to this point because that's the area in which we live. We live in the toes of this image in 2021. This is where we are on the prophetic timetable. So we have this vision by this king. We have the interpretation by a man of God named Daniel. It turns out that the image that Nebuchadnezzar sees, the interpretation that Daniel gives that he got from God, has to do with human history in advance. As I said last week, this is one of the reasons this book is so attacked, because he nailed it. I mean, over 2,100 years of human history in advance. And this guy sitting there in 560 BC, he nailed it. Spot on, exactly. To the extent that an unbeliever will look at that and say, no, there's just no way that's possible, because they can't do it. The Babylonian soothsayers couldn't do it. The magicians couldn't do it. None of that type in Nebuchadnezzar's day could do it. And birds of a feather flock together. The idiots today making predictions and so forth, they can't do it. And so when somebody comes along and does do it, they say, well, there's got to be cheating involved. There's got to be something else involved here, because there's no way that they can do it. Well, Daniel did it. Go back to Daniel again. Chapter 2. Beginning in verse 36. This is the dream. And we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. Thou, O king, art a king of kings. For the God in heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory. Notice it's God who gave it to him. Daniel just flat out says, hey, God gave this to you. You say, well, what's God doing, giving some bad guy all this power and all this glory and all this? Hey, he's God. He can do whatever he wants. He doesn't march to your agenda or my agenda. He's God. He can give it to whoever he wants. He can take it from whoever he wants. He can do with whatever he wants. It's all his. Verse 38. And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of heaven hath he given unto thine hand, and made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold. He is absolute master of everything he sees. Verse 39, and after thee shall arise another kingdom, inferior. This is the Medes and the Persians. To thee, inferior to thee. And another third kingdom. So after the Medes and Persians, here come the Greeks. Third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom, after the Greeks, come the Romans. And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron. For as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things. And as iron that breaketh all these, shall it break in pieces and bruise. And whereas, and here comes the interesting part, whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. But there shall be in it the strength of iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. This is the Antichrist kingdom. It's an amalgamation. It's an extension of the Roman Empire. If you look at the European common market and the influences that they exert, it is the old Roman Empire. It's Europe, it's North Africa, it's the Near East. That whole Mediterranean influx. That's the Roman Empire of yesterday. That's going to be the revived Roman Empire, the feet and the 10 toes of today. The analogy, the two arms, the Medes and the Persians. We get down in this image, we have the legs of iron, which is the Roman Empire, but in 364 or so BC, the Roman Empire splits off into two sections. You have the Western arm, one leg. You have the Eastern arm, another leg. Western arm was still ruled by Rome, although at this time, Rome was just a shadow of its former self. I mean, the Vandals and the Goths and the Visigoths and Attila the Hun and all these guys had come in, they'd sacked Rome. And from an economic standpoint, from a political standpoint, Rome was finished. From a religious standpoint, though, they were still king of the hill. So you have the Eastern and the Western part of the Roman Empire. We get down today. The 10 toes, the European Common Market, the European Federation, whatever name they want to check. We're talking about the 10 toes. And I remember as a young Christian back in the early 60s or so, and everybody was counting because then we had that new phenomenon called the European Common Market. And then as one country after another joined it, well, we got 8 members, we got 9 members, ooh, we got 10 members. Oh, wow, the Lord's going to come back because now we've got the 10 toes of the European Common Market, the revival of the old Roman Empire. These are the feet and toes that are mentioned of in Daniel chapter 2. Whoa, all right, we're home free. But then, oops, an 11th country came in and a 12th country came in. And I think now we're up to like 14, 18, 20 some countries that are loosely affiliated with what is now known as the European Common Market. So that blew that whole theory out of the water. And all the Christians got all bummed out because now there weren't just the 10 toes. Now there was, dozens of toes in this thing, and they didn't know how to confront it. Well, we're not over yet. We're still a work in progress, this European Common Market. It will eventually shake itself out into 10. England's already left. Brexit, a couple of years ago, they had that vote. They voted themselves out of the common market. So this is still in flux. So Christian, don't get all bent out of shape because we're not down to the 10 toes yet. We're still fluctuating here. When it's all over, when it all boils out, we're going to have 10. I want to finish with this today. Back in the 1700s, there was a guy by the name of Alexander Tiddler. And he was a Scottish judge and teacher. And he was a historian of history. And he came up with what I've heard this thing from Chuck Missler. I've heard it from a lot of different guys. I've seen it in print. David Jeremiah has put it in one of his books. But I want to read this quote from Alexander Tiddler back from the 1700s and see if you can see us in this thing today. When the 13 colonies were still part of England, Scottish professor Alexander Tiddler wrote about the fall of the Athenian Republic over 1,000 years before. Tiddler wrote this thing back when America was still just 13 colonies. He didn't, again, this is a prophetic type thing. And here's what he wrote. A democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government It can only exist until the voters discover that they can vote themselves money from the public treasure. Let me say that again. A democracy can only last as long as the voters haven't figured out that they can vote themselves money from the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidates promising the most money from the public treasury, with the result that a democracy always collapses over the loose fiscal policy followed by a dictatorship. Hello, we're in 2021. Anybody ever heard of the nanny state? Anybody ever heard of money for nothing? We're getting stimulus checks as I speak right now. What do we do to earn a stimulus check? I realize that the government, by prohibitive things, have hurt our ability to make money. By these cockamamie shutdowns and restrictions and so forth, they've hindered, and so in order to keep themselves afloat on an individual basis, what do? They vote money to the people from the public treasury. We call it a stimulus package. The average age of the world's great civilizations has been 200 years, average. Those nations have progressed through the following sequence. And get this, because this is so spot on, it is spooky. Written back in the 1700s, when America was still just 13 colonies. This is the progression that he lists. These nations have progressed through the following sequence: from bondage to spiritual faith, from spiritual faith to great courage, from courage to liberty, from liberty to abundance, from abundance to selfishness, from selfishness to complacency, from complacency to apathy, from apathy to dependency, from dependency back to bondage. That's the full cycle of human nature. Can you see us in this? Where do you think we are? We are definitely in the dependent stage. America started out in bondage to Great Britain. We had a revolution. We won it. From bondage, we went to faith. We can do it. We're going to conquer this continent. Manifest destiny. It's ours. We went from spiritual faith to great courage. We built the railroads. We made all the inventions that, modern society depends on. Liberty. We fight the First World War. Abundance. America has had more. We didn't know what to do with it. And then we got selfish. And then after the selfish, then we get complacent. After complacent, go to apathy. Nah, I don't care who's in office. I don't care who the president is. It's all the same to me. I get up, do my 8 hours, I go home. Doesn't matter to me. Who cares? They're all the same anyway. If I vote for this guy, he's going to promise me this and he's going to give me that. If I vote for this guy, he's going to promise me this, but he's still going to give me the same thing. Who cares? And that's where a lot of us are right now. It's apathy. And then from apathy, we go to dependency. Government has to take care of us. They have to tell us what we can drive. They have to tell us what kind of gas we can use. They have to tell us when to put solar in. They have to tell us what kind of toilets we can flush with. They have to tell us how many hours a week we can work. They have to tell us this, tell us that, what we can eat, what we can't eat, what we can inject, what we can't inject, what we can swallow, what we can't swallow. I mean, go right down the line. Government tells us everything. We are dependent on it. And some people are at a stage where they can't function without the government telling them or giving them approval to do this, that, or the other thing. From dependency, right back to bondage. It's an amazing thing. Prophecy, insight. At the end of it all, there's God who is in total control. He is still on the throne. Oh, I wanted to throw one more thing. I tried to get to last week and I forgot about Daniel, who wrote this whole thing. There's only 3 people in the entire Bible that God has nothing bad to say about, who, I mean, lived long enough for him to say, a little baby born here, a little kid there, they're in and out, boom, no big deal. But I'm talking about somebody who lived a lifetime in the scriptures here. Only 3 people. One was Joseph. Nothing derogatory, nothing bad, nothing at all bad about this guy. In his whole life, from his birth until his death, is recorded in the Bible, and not one single solitary bad thing about it. The other, obviously, is Jesus Christ. Duh, not a bad thing about him. The third guy happens to be Daniel. Daniel lived to be approximately 90 years old. 70 of those years, he was a big shot, a high government functionary in a foreign government. Nothing bad about him. In 70 years of his life, God had nothing negative, nothing bad to say about this guy. It's an amazing character. It's one of the most amazing books in the whole Bible. So next week, we'll pick up on something else. There's 3 or 4 other big visions and dreams and interpretations that Daniel has in this book. And we'll hit another one of them next time. Heavenly Father, I thank you. Number one, that you are God. And that sounds like a stupid, redundant thing to say, but I really mean it. And without me giving a 20-minute explanation of this thing, exactly what I mean when I say that I thank you for being God. I thank you that you can pick men to do your work for you, the jobs that you have, that you appoint, that the life that you choose for certain examples, the warnings that other people live through so that we might be encouraged, or we might be afraid, or we might be warned. Don't live like this guy. So you put his life in that book. Live like this guy. And you put his life in the book. And we have a roadmap as such. We know who to emulate. We know who to avoid. And you've laid it all out there for us. Our problem is we just don't listen. So, Father, for somebody like a Daniel, who was a young man, a young boy, taken from his family, taken from his home, taken from his country, never to see his homeland again, never to see Jerusalem again, never to see the temple again. What a sad thing. And yet, you enabled him, you blessed him, you rewarded him with an intimacy the likes of which few of us have ever known. Lord, we need help today. We are in that dependent stage of our culture. We rely on the government for everything, where we should be relying on you for everything. We have taken you out of schools. We have taken you out of churches as such. We've taken you out of the town square. We've taken you out of City Hall. We've taken you out of everything. And we wonder why we're in the boat that we're in now. We wonder why our children are falling by the wayside. We wonder why our country is going to hell in a handbasket. It's because we as a nation have forgotten you and your principles and your dictates and your commands. We've forgotten them. Father, I pray for the country. I pray for our leaders. I am even commanded by the Bible to pray for Biden. As hard as that pill is to swallow, I do pray for him. Because if he goes down, we go down. So, Lord, bless your people on an individual basis. There are little pockets of Christianity. There are still little pockets of faith. There are still little pockets of people who love you, who depend on you, who worship you. My prayer today is for them, that you bless them and watch over them. In Jesus' name. We'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in.